The words hit me like a sledgehammer to the chest when my daughter's fiancé, Damien Castellano, called me into their pristine living room in Millbrook Heights. "Mrs. Thornfield," he said, his voice cold and calculated, "I think it would be best if you didn't attend the wedding. Your presence would create complications for our families, reputations." What Damien didn't know, what nobody knew, was that I owned Rosewood Manor, the prestigious venue where they plan to say their vows in just 3 weeks. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. I sat there in stunned silence, watching my daughter Chloe avoid my eyes as her future husband delivered this devastating blow. 26 years of bedtime stories, scraped knees, graduation celebrations, and mother-daughter shopping trips, all reduced to a complication. The man who had barely known my daughter for 2 years was erasing me from the most important day of her life, and she was letting him. But here's what made this betrayal cut even deeper. I wasn't just some embarrassing relative they wanted to hide. I was Lydia Thornfield, the woman who had spent the last 15 years building a hospitality empire from nothing. The same empire that now included the very venue where Damien thought he could humiliate me. The irony was almost laughable. Almost. Before we dive deeper into this story that will leave you questioning everything you thought you knew about family loyalty, tell us where you're watching from in the comments below. And if this story of betrayal and ultimate justice resonates with you, make sure you hit that subscribe button, because tomorrow I have something even more shocking waiting for you. You see, Rosewood Manor wasn't just any wedding venue. It was the crown jewel of Willowbrook County, a sprawling estate with manicured gardens, crystal chandeliers, and a reputation for hosting only the most exclusive events. Politicians, celebrities, and old-money families had all celebrated their most important moments within those elegant walls. It was the kind of place that had a 3-year waiting list and charged more for a single evening than most people made in 6 months. When Chloe had breathlessly called me 6 months earlier to announce that Damien had proposed, her first words after "I'm engaged" were about the venue. "Mom, you'll never believe it. Damien's family has connections at Rosewood Manor. We might actually be able to get married there." The excitement in her voice had been pure and genuine, the same joy I'd heard when she was 7 years old and discovered we were going to Disney World. I had smiled and congratulated her, my heart swelling with pride and happiness for my daughter. What I didn't tell her was that those connections weren't necessary. I could have secured that venue with a single phone call, because the deed to Rosewood Manor sat in my office safe, right next to the deeds for the Grandview Hotel downtown and the Sunset Resort on Lake Harmony. But I had learned long ago to keep my business success separate from my role as Chloe's mother. Too many relationships had been poisoned by money, and I refused to let that happen with my daughter. I wanted her to love me for who I was, not what I could provide. So I had built my empire quietly, carefully, always ensuring that Chloe saw me as mom first and businesswoman second. The Castellano family had no idea they were dealing with someone who could buy and sell their textile import business 3 times over. They saw what I allowed them to see, a single mother who worked in hospitality management. Technically true, though it undersold the reality that I managed a portfolio worth over $40 million. As I sat in that pristine living room, surrounded by the expensive furniture that Damien's family money had purchased, I realized that this moment had been building for months. The subtle comments about my background, the way Damien's mother, Patricia Castellano, would smile tightly when I mentioned my work, the increasingly rare invitations to family gatherings. They had been positioning me as an outsider from the beginning, and now they were ready to make it official. "I understand this might be difficult to hear," Damien continued, his tone suggesting he found this conversation mildly inconvenient rather than devastating. "But the Castellano name carries certain expectations in our social circles. My mother has worked very hard to cultivate our family's reputation, and having someone from your background prominently featured at the wedding could send the wrong message." My background. As if being a self-made millionaire was something to be ashamed of. As if raising a daughter single-handedly while building a business empire was somehow less respectable than inheriting money from previous generations. But what destroyed me wasn't Damien's snobbery. I had dealt with entitled rich boys before. What broke my heart was the way Chloe sat there, silent and complicit, picking at her manicured nails while the man she planned to marry dismissed her mother like yesterday's trash. "Chloe," I said softly, hoping to reach the daughter I had raised to be strong and independent. "Do you agree with this decision?" She finally looked at me, and I saw a stranger in her eyes. "Mom, Damien's just trying to avoid any awkwardness. You know how these high society events can be. Maybe it's better if you sit this one out." Sit this one out, as if my daughter's wedding was a casual lunch date I could politely decline. That's when I made a decision that would change everything. I stood up slowly, gathering my purse with the same dignity I had maintained through every business negotiation, every hostile takeover attempt, every moment when someone had underestimated the quiet woman in the corner. "I understand," I said, my voice steady despite the earthquake happening in my chest. "I wouldn't want to cause any complications." As I walked toward the door, I heard Damien tell Chloe how mature I was being about the situation, how reasonable, how this proved they had made the right choice. They had no idea that in exactly 72 hours, they would discover just how complicated things could become when you tried to humiliate Lydia Thornfield. Because while they saw me as disposable, I was about to remind them that in the hospitality business, the person who owns the venue has all the power. And I was very much looking forward to exercising that power. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. I wasn't born into wealth. I was born into struggle. 27 years ago, I was Lydia Morrison, a 19-year-old waitress at Mel's Diner in downtown Riverside, serving coffee and dreams to anyone who would listen. My uniform always smelled like bacon grease, my feet ached from 12-hour shifts, and my bank account rarely had more than $50 in it. Everything changed the night I met James Thornfield. He walked into that rundown diner at 2 a.m., exhausted from a business meeting that had gone late. While other customers barely looked at me, James asked about my day, remembered my name, and left a tip that was larger than most people's entire meal. But what captured my heart wasn't his money. It was the way he listened when I talked about my dreams of opening my own restaurant someday. James was already successful then, the heir to a modest but profitable construction company. Our whirlwind romance felt like something out of a fairy tale. Within 6 months, we were married. Within a year, I was pregnant with Chloe. For 3 beautiful years, I lived in a world I had never imagined. Elegant dinner parties, charity galas, a sprawling house in Thornfield Heights that James had inherited from his grandmother. But fairy tales don't prepare you for tragedy. James died in a construction accident when Chloe was barely 3 years old. A crane malfunction at one of his job sites took him instantly, leaving me drowning in grief and facing a reality I wasn't prepared for. The construction business was struggling, weighed down by debt that James had hidden from me. His family, who had never fully accepted the waitress who married their golden boy, made it clear that I wasn't welcome to stay in their social circle as a widow. The lawyers explained it simply. I could sell the failing business to pay off the debts and maybe walk away with enough to rent a small apartment. Or I could take a massive risk and try to save the company myself. Everyone advised me to sell. Everyone except Mrs. Ruby Fairweather, James's secretary, who had become something of a surrogate mother to me. "Lydia," she said, sitting across from me in that intimidating lawyer's office while Chloe napped in her stroller, "James used to say you had more business sense than anyone he'd ever met. He saw something in you that you haven't seen in yourself yet." That night, I made a decision that terrified me. I would save Thornfield Construction, not just for the money, but to prove to myself and to James's family that I was more than just a pretty face who got lucky. The first year was hell. I worked 18-hour days, learning everything about construction, permits, zoning laws, and client relations, while trying to be a mother to a confused toddler who kept asking when Daddy was coming home. I made mistakes, costly ones. I lost contracts because clients didn't trust a young widow to manage major projects. I nearly went bankrupt twice. But I also discovered something about myself. I was good at this, really good. While other construction companies focused solely on building, I understood that construction was really about hospitality, making clients feel comfortable, managing their expectations, creating spaces where people wanted to spend time. By Chloe's 5th birthday, I had not only saved Thornfield Construction, but expanded it into commercial hospitality projects. Hotels, restaurants, event venues. I specialized in creating spaces that made people feel special. When the opportunity came to purchase a struggling hotel downtown, I didn't just renovate it. I transformed it into the Grandview, the most sought-after boutique hotel in the city. The pattern continued. I would identify struggling hospitality properties, purchase them at a fraction of their potential value, and reimagine them into something extraordinary. The Sunset Resort on Lake Harmony, the Willowbrook Conference Center, the Riverside Event Hall. Each property became more successful than the last, and my reputation in the industry grew. But the crown jewel came 8 years ago, when the historic Rosewood Manor came up for auction. The previous owners had let it fall into disrepair, and the astronomical renovation costs scared away most bidders. I saw what others couldn't, the potential to create something truly magical. I bought Rosewood Manor for $1.2 million and spent 3 years and another $8 million restoring it to its former glory, and then making it even better. Heated marble floors, a state-of-the-art sound system, gardens designed by the same landscape architect who worked on the governor's mansion. I created the most exclusive wedding venue in the tri-state area. Throughout all of this, I made sure Chloe never felt like my work was more important than she was. I attended every school play, every soccer game, every parent-teacher conference. I helped with homework at midnight after finishing contract negotiations. I taught her that success meant working hard, treating people with respect, and never forgetting where you came from. What I didn't teach her, apparently, was how to recognize those same values in the man she chose to marry. As Chloe grew older, I deliberately kept the full extent of my wealth private. She knew I was successful, knew we were comfortable, but I never wanted her to be targeted for my money, or to develop the kind of entitled attitude I saw in so many wealthy children. I drove modest cars, lived in a nice but not ostentatious house, and always emphasized the importance of earning your own way in the world. Maybe that was my mistake. Maybe if Chloe had truly understood what I had built, she would have had more respect for it. Maybe if the Castellano family knew they were dealing with someone who could buy their family business without blinking, they would have treated me differently. But I had built my empire on the principle that respect should be earned through character, not intimidation through wealth. I believed that if you treated people well, they would treat you well in return. Sitting in my car outside Chloe and Damien's house after that devastating conversation, I realized how naive that belief had been. Some people would always see kindness as weakness, humility as inferiority, and quiet strength as something they could easily dismiss. The Castellano family was about to learn that they had made a very expensive mistake. By the time Chloe turned 16, I had become something I never expected, one of the most influential women in the hospitality industry across 3 states. The shy waitress who once served coffee for tips now sat on the boards of the Regional Tourism Council and the Historic Preservation Society. But more importantly, I had created something that would last. A legacy built on excellence, integrity, and the belief that every celebration deserved to be extraordinary. The transformation of Rosewood Manor had become the stuff of industry legend. What started as a crumbling Victorian mansion with leaking roofs and rotting floors had evolved into a venue so exclusive that celebrities flew in from both coasts just to get married there. The waiting list stretched 3 years, and the deposit alone was more than most people's annual salary. Yet every weekend, the manor was booked solid, hosting events that would be featured in magazines and talked about for years. The secret to my success wasn't just the money I invested, it was understanding what people truly wanted. When wealthy families planned their children's weddings, they weren't just buying a venue, they were purchasing a fantasy, a moment of perfection that would live in their memories forever. I gave them fairy tale gardens with fountains that danced to music, ballrooms with ceilings painted by artists I flew in from Italy, and service so seamless that guests felt like royalty. But Rosewood Manor was just the flagship. The Grandview Hotel downtown had become the preferred accommodation for visiting dignitaries and business leaders. When the governor's wife needed a place to host her charity luncheon, she called me personally. When tech executives came to town for conferences, they stayed in my suites and held their meetings in my private dining rooms. The Sunset Resort on Lake Harmony had transformed from a failing family camp into a luxury destination that attracted couples from across the country for romantic getaways. I had imported sand from the Caribbean to create a private beach, built a spa that offered treatments using ingredients from my own organic garden, and created hiking trails through the surrounding forest that led to hidden gazebos perfect for marriage proposals. Each property reflected the same philosophy. Attention to detail so meticulous that guests noticed things they couldn't quite articulate but that made them feel special. Hand-milled soap in the bathrooms, linens changed twice daily, staff trained to remember returning guests, preferences, fresh flowers arranged daily by a team of florists I kept on permanent retainer. The financial success had been staggering. What started as a desperate attempt to save a failing construction company had grown into an empire worth over $47 million and climbing. I employed over 200 people across my various properties, many of whom had been with me for over a decade. I had created jobs, revitalized neighborhoods, and brought millions of dollars in tourism revenue to our region. Yet despite all this success, I remained deliberately understated in my personal life. I still lived in the same house where Chloe had grown up, though I had renovated it extensively over the years. I drove a reliable but unremarkable sedan, not because I couldn't afford better, but because I never wanted my wealth to become my identity. I had seen too many wealthy people become consumed by their possessions, forgetting the values that had made their success possible in the first place. Chloe's childhood had been comfortable but grounded. She attended excellent schools, participated in activities she enjoyed, and never wanted for anything important. But I made sure she worked for her spending money once she turned 14, starting with small jobs at my properties during summer breaks. She learned to appreciate the effort that went into creating beautiful experiences for others, or so I thought. When she graduated from Millbrook University with a degree in marketing, I was incredibly proud. She had earned solid grades, made lasting friendships, and seemed to understand the value of hard work. She found a good job at a local advertising agency and moved into her own apartment, though I helped with the deposit, a decision I made carefully, wanting to support her independence without creating dependence. The business world had taken notice of my success. I was regularly invited to speak at hospitality conferences, had been featured on the cover of Regional Business magazine 3 times, and was frequently consulted by other entrepreneurs looking to break into the luxury hospitality market. The article that had appeared in National Hospitality Trends last year called me the quiet visionary who redefined luxury events. But perhaps my proudest achievement was the scholarship program I had established through the Thornfield Foundation. Every year, I provided full college tuition for 5 young people from working-class families who showed exceptional promise but lacked the financial resources to pursue higher education. The recipients came from backgrounds similar to my own: children of waitresses, construction workers, housekeepers, and shop clerks who had the intelligence and drive to succeed but needed someone to believe in them. One of my scholarship recipients, Amanda Rodriguez, had just graduated from law school and joined one of the city's most prestigious firms. Another, Marcus Chen, had become a chef and recently opened his own restaurant. These young people understood what it meant to work for something, to appreciate opportunities, and to remember where they came from. The irony wasn't lost on me that while I was helping strangers' children achieve their dreams, my own daughter seemed increasingly disconnected from the values I had tried to instill in her. The change had been gradual but unmistakable, beginning around the time she met Damien Castellano at a charity gala I had sponsored. The Castellano family moved in the old money circles of Milbrook County, the kind of people who inherited their wealth rather than earning it. Antonio Castellano had built the family textile import business into a regional success, but it was nothing compared to what I had accomplished. Their net worth was probably a third of mine, but they carried themselves with the arrogance of people who had never known struggle. What troubled me most was watching Chloe gradually adopt their attitudes. She began making subtle comments about new money versus old money, dismissing people who worked in service industries, and showing less appreciation for the things I had provided for her. When I gently pointed out these changes, she accused me of being too sensitive or not understanding how things work in their social circle. The engagement announcement had come as a surprise. Chloe and Damien had only been dating for 8 months, and while I wanted my daughter to be happy, something about their relationship felt rushed and superficial. Damien was handsome and charming in public, but I had noticed how he spoke to service staff at restaurants, how he interrupted Chloe when she was talking, and how he seemed to view her more as an accessory than as a partner. But I had kept my concerns to myself, hoping that my daughter's intelligence and strength would guide her toward the right decisions. I had raised her to be independent, to trust her own judgment, and to choose partners who respected and valued her. Now, sitting in my office overlooking the gardens of Rosewood Manor, I realized that my restraint had been a mistake. By trying to be the supportive mother who didn't interfere, I had allowed my daughter to drift away from everything I had taught her about dignity, respect, and the importance of surrounding yourself with people who saw your worth. The wedding contract for Mr. and Mrs. Castellano sat on my desk, signed 3 months ago when they had booked the venue through my assistant, never knowing that the owner they were paying was the same woman they now considered unworthy of attending their celebration. As I stared at that contract, I realized that my business success had taught me one invaluable lesson. Sometimes, the only way to make people understand your value is to show them what life looks like without you. The first time I met Damien Castellano, I thought he might be exactly what my daughter needed. It was at the annual Children's Hospital Charity Gala that I sponsored every year at the Grandview Hotel, and he appeared to be everything a mother could want for her child. Well-educated, professionally successful, and genuinely interested in what Chloe had to say. He was 28 to Chloe's 25, tall and classically handsome with the kind of confident bearing that came from never having to doubt your place in the world. When Chloe introduced us, he looked me directly in the eye, offered a firm handshake, and said, "Mrs. Thornfield, Chloe speaks about you constantly. It's clear she admires you tremendously." That night, I watched them together on the dance floor and felt a warmth I hadn't experienced since James died. Chloe was laughing, truly laughing, in a way I hadn't seen in months. Her previous relationships had been with boys her own age, who seemed intimidated by her intelligence and ambition. Damien, by contrast, appeared to encourage her to shine. When they stopped by my table between dances, he asked thoughtful questions about my work with the Children's Hospital Board. "Chloe mentioned you've been instrumental in funding their new pediatric wing," he said. "That must be incredibly rewarding work." He seemed genuinely interested in my answer, nodding thoughtfully as I explained the hospital's expansion plans. As the evening progressed, I found myself cautiously optimistic about this new development in Chloe's life. Damien came from a good family. The Castellanos had been pillars of Milbrook County society for 3 generations. His father, Antonio, ran a successful textile import business, and his mother, Patricia, was active in various charitable organizations. They were the kind of established family that could provide stability and social connections that might benefit Chloe's future. More importantly, Damien seemed to appreciate my daughter's intelligence and independence. During dinner, when the conversation turned to local business development, he actively encouraged Chloe to share her insights from her marketing work. Chloe has some fascinating ideas about how the city could better promote tourism, he told the table. She really understands how to connect with younger demographics. The relationship progressed steadily over the following months. Damien would pick Chloe up for dinner dates, always arriving punctually and dressed appropriately. He brought her flowers, not expensive orchids that screamed of trying too hard, but simple bouquets of daisies and tulips that showed he had been paying attention to her preferences. When I invited him to join us for Sunday brunch at my home, he arrived with homemade scones that his grandmother had taught him to bake. "I have to admit," he said, laughing as we sat on my back patio overlooking the garden, "I'm not much of a cook, but Gran insisted that any man worth his salt should know how to make at least one thing from scratch." The scones were delicious, and I appreciated both the gesture and the story behind it. During those early months, Damien seemed genuinely interested in understanding Chloe's background and family history. He asked questions about her childhood, about the challenges of single parenthood, and about how I had managed to balance building a career with raising a daughter. His questions felt sincere rather than intrusive, and he listened to my answers with apparent respect. When Chloe mentioned that I worked in hospitality management, Damien nodded approvingly. "The service industry is so important," he said. "My family has always believed that businesses serving the public require exceptional skill and dedication. It takes a special kind of person to consistently exceed people's expectations." I began to relax around him, something that didn't come easily when it came to men showing interest in my daughter. Perhaps it was because he seemed secure in himself, not threatened by Chloe's close relationship with me or by her professional ambitions. When she mentioned working late on a difficult campaign, he would encourage her to stay focused on her goals, rather than pressuring her to prioritize their social plans. The introduction to his family came about 4 months into their relationship. Patricia Castellano invited Chloe and me to join them for brunch at the Millbrook Country Club, and I accepted, curious to meet the people who had raised this seemingly well-grounded young man. The country club was everything I expected, understated elegance designed to whisper rather than shout about wealth. Patricia Castellano was impeccably dressed in a way that suggested effortless sophistication, though I recognized the careful attention to detail that went into achieving such an effect. Antonio was cordial and business-minded, asking intelligent questions about the local economy and regional development. During that first meeting, the Castellanos treated me with polite respect. Patricia complimented my dress, a simple but well-tailored piece I had purchased for speaking engagements. Antonio asked about my work in hospitality, and when I mentioned managing events and guest services, he nodded approvingly. "Customer service is the foundation of any successful business," he said. "Without satisfied clients, everything else falls apart." The conversation was pleasant, covering safe topics like local politics, the weather, and mutual acquaintances. Damien was attentive to both Chloe and me, making sure we were included in every discussion and smoothly redirecting the conversation when his father began what appeared to be a familiar lecture about import regulations. After brunch, as we walked to our cars, Patricia took my arm gently. "Lydia, it's been such a pleasure meeting you. Damien has told us wonderful things about you and Chloe. You've clearly raised a remarkable young woman." Her words seemed genuine, and I found myself thinking that perhaps Chloe had found a family that would welcome her warmly. Over the next few months, there were more gatherings, casual dinners, attendance at charity events, and holiday celebrations. The Castellanos always included me in their invitations, and I began to feel cautiously optimistic about the direction things were heading. Damien continued to be respectful and attentive, and Chloe seemed genuinely happy in a way I hadn't seen since her college years. When Damien mentioned that he was considering proposing, he actually asked for my blessing first. "Mrs. Thornfield," he said during one of our Sunday brunches, "I hope you know how much I care about Chloe. I'd like to ask her to marry me, but I wanted to speak with you first. Your opinion matters to her, and it matters to me." I was touched by the gesture and by his apparent understanding of the importance of family relationships. "What matters most to me," I told him, "is Chloe's happiness. If you believe you can provide that, then you have my blessing." The proposal itself was everything Chloe had dreamed of: a romantic dinner overlooking the lake, followed by a sunset walk through the botanical gardens, where Damien had arranged for a string quartet to play her favorite songs. The ring was beautiful but not ostentatious, a classic solitaire that reflected Chloe's preference for timeless elegance over trendy displays. In those first weeks after the engagement, I watched my daughter plan her future with excitement and joy. She talked about potential venues, discussed guest lists, and began looking at wedding dresses with the kind of enthusiasm that reminded me of the little girl who used to plan elaborate tea parties for her stuffed animals. It was only gradually that I began to notice subtle changes. Damien's comments about guest lists started to include phrases like appropriate connections and family reputation. His suggestions about venues focused not on what Chloe might prefer, but on what would make the right impression for their social circle. When Chloe mentioned possibly having the ceremony at one of the charming historic churches downtown, Damien gently steered her toward more prestigious locations. "Sweetheart," he said during one planning session I attended, "we want to make sure the venue reflects the importance of this occasion. Your family and friends deserve something truly special." At first, these seemed like reasonable considerations from a man who wanted to give his bride the best possible celebration. It was only much later that I would understand these early conversations as the beginning of a calculated campaign to reshape not just the wedding, but Chloe's understanding of what constituted value and respectability. The man I had initially welcomed as a positive influence in my daughter's life was slowly but systematically beginning to change her perspective on everything I had taught her about worth, character, and the importance of staying true to your values. But those revelations were still weeks away. For now, I was simply a mother watching her daughter fall in love, believing that I had successfully raised a young woman who would choose a partner worthy of her heart. The first crack in the facade appeared during what should have been a joyful occasion: Chloe's birthday dinner 3 months after the engagement. I had made reservations at Bellecourt, an intimate Italian restaurant downtown that had been one of our favorite mother-daughter spots for years. The owner, Giuseppe Moretti, always made sure we had the corner table by the window, and Chloe loved their handmade pasta and the way Giuseppe would personally recommend wine pairings. When Damien arrived to pick us up, he seemed surprised by the choice. "Bellecourt," he said, checking the address on his phone. "I've never heard of it. Are you sure it's appropriate for such a special occasion?" "It's perfect," Chloe assured him, though I noticed a slight hesitation in her voice that hadn't been there before. "Mom and I have been going there since I was in college. Giuseppe makes the most incredible osso buco." During the drive, Damien made several comments about the neighborhood we were passing through. "This area's really authentic, isn't it?" he said, and the way he said authentic made it sound like a polite substitute for something less flattering. I suppose there's something to be said for these family-run places, though I worry about consistency in establishments that don't have proper corporate oversight. At the restaurant, things got worse. When Giuseppe approached our table with his usual warmth, greeting me by name and congratulating Chloe on her engagement, Damien's smile became strained. Giuseppe's English, while perfectly understandable, carried the accent of someone who had immigrated from Sicily in his 20s, and I watched Damien's expression shift to barely concealed impatience every time Giuseppe spoke. "The wine list here is quite limited," Damien murmured to Chloe, though Giuseppe was standing right there. "Perhaps we should have gone somewhere with a more extensive selection." Giuseppe, who had been in the hospitality business for over 30 years, handled the slight with gracious professionalism, but I saw the flash of hurt in his eyes before he excused himself to check on other tables. This was a man who had built his restaurant from nothing, who knew every regular customer's preferences by heart, who had comped our meals during the months after James died when money was tight. To see him dismissed so casually by my daughter's fiancé felt like a personal insult. But what troubled me more was watching Chloe's reaction. Instead of defending Giuseppe or expressing displeasure at Damien's rudeness, she seemed embarrassed, not by Damien's behavior, but by the restaurant itself. She kept glancing around nervously, as if seeing the cozy, unpretentious atmosphere through his eyes for the first time. When Giuseppe brought our appetizers, Damien barely looked up from his phone. "Excuse me," he said without making eye contact. "Could you make sure the kitchen knows I have a severe allergy to shellfish? I didn't see any warnings on the menu, and I'm concerned about cross-contamination." Giuseppe nodded seriously. "Of course, sir. I will speak to the chef personally. We are very careful about allergies." After Giuseppe left, I turned to Damien. "I've never heard you mention a shellfish allergy before." "It's developed recently," he said dismissively. "These smaller establishments often don't have proper protocols in place. I just want to make sure they're taking adequate precautions." The rest of the dinner was strained. Damien found fault with everything. The bread was too crusty, the lighting was too dim, the table next to us was too loud. Each complaint was delivered with a polite smile, but the message was clear: this place wasn't good enough for him, and by extension, it shouldn't be good enough for us. The real turning point came the following week when Chloe called to cancel our regular Sunday brunch. "Damien's mother wants to take me shopping for my dress," she explained. "She knows this boutique in the city that carries really exclusive designers. Apparently, they don't even let most people make appointments without references." This was concerning for several reasons. First, Chloe and I had already planned to go dress shopping together. It was something I had been looking forward to since she was a little girl playing dress-up in my closet. Second, the dismissive way she mentioned most people suggested she was already beginning to see herself as somehow above ordinary customers. "What about the appointment we made at Magnolia Bridal?" I asked. "You were so excited about their vintage collection." "Oh, Mom," Chloe said, and there was something new in her voice, a slight condescension that made my heart sink. "Patricia says vintage is really more for people who can't afford new. She thinks it's important that I have something that's never been worn before, something that reflects our family's status." Our family's status. The phrase hit me like a slap. Since when did Chloe measure worth by status? Since when did she use possessive pronouns that excluded me from consideration? The changes accelerated after that. Chloe began declining invitations to events she had always enjoyed. The annual fundraiser for the literacy program? Damien thinks local charities are inefficient. He says we should focus on causes with more national impact. The art festival downtown where we had volunteered together for 5 years? Patricia says it's important to be selective about public appearances. People judge you by the events you attend. Even our simple traditions began to disappear. When I suggested our usual Friday night movie and takeout, Chloe hesitated. "Actually, Mom, I've been thinking we should try some new restaurants. Damien's been introducing me to places with real culinary pedigree. There's this amazing chef who trained in France." Each conversation left me feeling more disconnected from the daughter I had raised. The young woman who used to get excited about hole-in-the-wall ethnic restaurants was now talking about culinary pedigree. The girl who had volunteered at the animal shelter throughout high school was now concerned about being quote, 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 quote. The most alarming change came during a family dinner at the Castellanos' home. I had been invited to join them for Patricia's birthday celebration, and I arrived with a carefully chosen gift, a first-edition book of poetry by a local author I knew Patricia admired. The evening started pleasantly enough, with polite conversation about the upcoming wedding and general community news. But as the wine flowed, the conversation took a different turn. Antonio began discussing the, quote, changing demographics of Willowbrook County. lamenting how certain types of businesses were lowering the tone of the downtown area. Patricia chimed in with concerns about maintaining standards and ensuring that the right sort of people continued to feel welcome in their social circles. What shocked me wasn't their casual classism. I had encountered that attitude before in business settings. What devastated me was watching Chloe nod along with their comments, even adding her own observations about how some areas of town were becoming less desirable. This was the same daughter who had once insisted we stop at every roadside lemonade stand because those kids are working so hard to earn money. The same girl who had volunteered to serve Thanksgiving dinner at the homeless shelter throughout her teenage years. The same young woman who had written her college application essay about the importance of judging people by their character rather than their circumstances. When Patricia mentioned that they were, quote, carefully curating the guest list for the wedding to ensure the right atmosphere, Chloe actually nodded in agreement. "It's important that everyone feels comfortable," she said, parroting language that I suspected came directly from Damien's coaching. "We want our celebration to reflect our values and aspirations." The drive home was silent. I wanted to ask Chloe what had happened to her actual values, the ones I had spent 25 years instilling in her. I wanted to remind her that comfort shouldn't come at the expense of excluding people who cared about her. But I could see that she was already anticipating criticism, her jaw set in the stubborn expression she had worn as a teenager, when she knew she was wrong but wasn't ready to admit it. Instead, I said quietly, "I hope you're happy, sweetheart. That's all I've ever wanted for you." "I am happy, Mom," she replied, but her voice lacked the conviction I hoped to hear. "Damien and his family are helping me understand how things work in their world. It's different from what I'm used to, but I'm learning to appreciate the importance of maintaining certain standards." Maintaining certain standards. The phrase echoed in my mind for days afterward. What standards were we talking about? The standard of treating service workers with respect? The standard of valuing people for their character rather than their bank accounts? The standard of staying loyal to the people who had supported you before you needed anything from them? As I reflected on the changes in my daughter, I began to understand that this wasn't just about wedding planning or social climbing. This was about the systematic dismantling of every value I had tried to teach her, replaced by a worldview that measured worth through exclusion rather than inclusion, through status rather than character. The worst part was realizing that Chloe wasn't being forced into these changes. She was embracing them willingly, perhaps even eagerly. The daughter I had raised to stand up for others was learning to look down on them instead. The phone call that would change everything came on a rainy Tuesday morning in March, exactly 6 months before the wedding date. I was in my office at the Grandview Hotel, reviewing quarterly reports and finalizing contracts for the spring wedding season, when my assistant, Rebecca Martinez, knocked on my door with an expression of barely contained excitement. "Mrs. Thornfield," she said, holding a thick folder against her chest, "you're not going to believe this. We just received the most prestigious booking request we've ever had. The Castellano family wants to reserve Rosewood Manor for their son's wedding in September." My coffee cup froze halfway to my lips. The Castellano family? Yes, can you believe it? They specifically requested Rosewood Manor after hearing about our reputation from several of their social connections. Apparently, Mrs. Patricia Castellano has been trying to secure a booking for months, but she was told our waiting list was completely full. Rebecca opened the folder and spread the preliminary paperwork across my desk. "She's offering to pay a 30% premium above our standard rate if we can accommodate them." I stared at the documents, my mind racing as the full implications hit me. There, in elegant script on expensive letterhead, was a formal request for the wedding celebration of Mr. Damien Antonio Castellano and Miss Chloe Elizabeth Thornfield on Saturday, September 15th. They had listed the expected guest count at 250 people, requested our premium package including the lakeside ceremony space, and indicated they wanted to discuss additional custom services to ensure an event befitting both families' reputations. The irony was so perfect it almost seemed fictional. For months, I had watched my daughter and her future in-laws systematically exclude me from wedding planning decisions, dismissing my opinions and making it clear that my input wasn't valued or wanted. Patricia Castellano had taken over every aspect of the arrangements, from the flower selections to the menu choices, always with subtle comments about how these decisions require a certain level of sophistication that implied I lacked the necessary refinement. Now, unknowingly, they had come crawling to me, the woman they considered beneath their social standards, begging to use the venue I owned, the business I had built, the reputation I had earned through decades of hard work and attention to excellence. "Rebecca," I said slowly, "what did you tell Mrs. Castellano when she called?" "I explained that you personally handle all bookings for September dates, since that's our peak season." She seemed a bit put out that she couldn't speak directly to the decision-maker, but I assured her that you would review the request personally. Rebecca paused, studying my expression. "Mrs. Thornfield, is everything all right? You look like you've seen a ghost." "In a way, I have," I murmured, picking up the contract and reading through the details more carefully. "Tell me exactly what Mrs. Castellano said during the conversation." Rebecca consulted her notes. She emphasized several times that this was a very important social event and that the Castellano family has significant influence in the community. She mentioned that they had initially hoped to book the Granshire estate, but apparently it's undergoing renovations. She said, and I quote, "We simply cannot have our son's wedding at some ordinary venue. It must be somewhere that reflects our family's standing." Each word felt like a small knife twisting in my chest. An ordinary venue. After everything I had accomplished, after building Rosewood Manor into the most sought-after wedding destination in 3 states, Patricia Castellano still saw my life's work as potentially ordinary, acceptable only because her first choice wasn't available. "There's more," Rebecca continued, flipping through her notes. She specifically requested that the event be handled with absolute discretion, and that the staff be instructed to maintain appropriate professional boundaries with the guests. She seems very concerned about, how did she put it, ensuring that the service maintains the proper tone throughout the celebration. Proper tone, professional boundaries. The language was a thinly veiled way of saying that the working-class people who would be serving them should know their place and not get too familiar with their social superiors. The same working-class people like Giuseppe at Bellacourt, like my scholarship recipients, like the woman I had been before I built my empire. Like me. "Did she mention anything about the bride's family?" I asked, though I suspected I already knew the answer. Rebecca shook her head. "Interestingly, no. All the communication has been focused on the Castellano family's requirements and preferences. She did mention that some adjustments might need to be made to accommodate different levels of sophistication among the wedding party, but she didn't elaborate on what that meant." Different levels of sophistication. My daughter was marrying into a family that saw me, as a sophistication deficit that needed to be managed and minimized. They were planning to celebrate her wedding at my venue, while simultaneously working to ensure that I had as little presence as possible in her life. The contract details were even more telling. Patricia had requested our most expensive package, including services that would cost nearly $60,000 for a single evening. She wanted the ceremony in our lakeside pavilion with its hand-carved Italian columns and crystal chandeliers. She wanted dinner served on our custom-designed china with gold leaf detailing. She wanted our sommelier to personally select wines from our private collection, including bottles that cost more than most people's monthly rent. Every single element of the celebration she was planning would be a direct result of my vision, my investment, my business acumen. The gardens where photos would be taken had been designed according to my specifications. The cuisine would be prepared in kitchens I had equipped with the finest professional appliances. The seamless service would be provided by staff I had personally trained to anticipate guests' needs before they were expressed. Yet in Patricia Castellano's mind, I was the embarrassing connection that needed to be hidden away, the unfortunate reminder of Chloe's lesser background that might taint the sophisticated atmosphere she was trying to create. As I read through the special requests section, my anger began to transform into something more strategic. Patricia had requested that the event coordinator be someone with extensive experience serving distinguished clientele, and that all staff members be, quote, vetted for their ability to interact appropriately with high society guests. She wanted a private bridal suite prepared with, quote, amenities reflecting the highest standards of luxury, and insisted that the catering staff be, quote, properly trained in formal service protocols. Every single one of these requests would be fulfilled by the business I had built from nothing. The distinguished clientele she was worried about impressing were people I had been serving successfully for over a decade. The, quote, highest standards of luxury, she demanded, were standards I had personally established and maintained. The formal service protocols she considered so important were protocols I had developed and taught to my staff. The most delicious irony of all was buried in the payment terms section. Patricia had specified that all charges should be billed directly to Castellano Textile Imports, attention Mr. Antonio Castellano, with copies sent to their family attorney for business expense documentation. They were so eager to demonstrate their wealth and importance that they wanted a paper trail showing they could afford to spend $60,000 on a single party. What they didn't realize was that this documentation would become evidence of their hypocrisy, proof that they had unknowingly paid a fortune to the very woman they considered unworthy of attending the celebration. I leaned back in my chair, looking out the window at the gardens of Rosewood Manor, where other couples were taking engagement photos, blissfully unaware of the drama unfolding in my office. In a few hours, I would need to decide how to respond to this booking request. I could accept it and take their money while watching them unknowingly pay me to host an event from which I was excluded. I could decline it and force them to scramble for an alternative venue just 6 months before the wedding. Or I could use this situation to finally make them understand exactly who they were dealing with. For months, I had been the accommodating mother, the understanding woman who stepped aside gracefully when her opinions weren't wanted. I had watched my daughter adopt values that contradicted everything I had taught her, had endured condescending comments about my background and my business, had accepted being marginalized in the planning of the most important day of my child's life. But now I held all the cards. The venue they desperately wanted belonged to me. The reputation they were trying to buy had been built by me. The sophisticated celebration they were planning would be executed by my vision, my staff, my standards of excellence. As I stared at that contract, I realized that Patricia Castellano had just handed me the perfect opportunity to teach them all a lesson about respect, about the value of hard work, and about the dangerous game of underestimating someone based on their perceived social status. The question was, what exactly was I going to do with this unexpected gift? The devastating blow came exactly 1 week after I had received the Rosewood Manor booking request, during what I thought would be a routine family dinner at Chloe and Damien's townhouse. I had accepted their invitation eagerly, hoping for a chance to reconnect with my daughter and perhaps address some of the distance that had grown between us over the past months. I arrived with a bottle of wine from my personal collection and homemade tiramisu, Chloe's favorite dessert since childhood. The evening started normally enough. We discussed the upcoming wedding logistics, the guest list updates, and Damien's recent promotion at his father's company. But I noticed an unusual tension in the air, a formality in their interactions with me that felt rehearsed and careful. Damien seemed particularly attentive, refilling my wine glass frequently and making sure I had the most comfortable chair in their living room. After dinner, as we moved to the sitting area for coffee and dessert, Damien cleared his throat in a way that suggested he had something important to say. Mrs. Thornfield, Lydia, there's something we need to discuss about the wedding arrangements. My heart began to race, though I wasn't sure why. Something in his tone, perhaps, or the way Chloe suddenly became very interested in arranging the coffee cups on the tray. We've been fortunate enough to secure Rosewood Manor for the reception, Damien continued, his voice carrying the measured cadence of someone who had practiced this speech. It's really a tremendous venue. Exactly the kind of elegant setting that will do justice to such an important occasion. I nodded, keeping my expression carefully neutral. It's supposed to be beautiful, very exclusive, I understand. Exactly, Damien smiled, seeming to take my comment as approval. That's actually what we wanted to talk to you about. The exclusivity, I mean. Rosewood Manor caters to a very particular clientele, and they have certain expectations about the tone and atmosphere of events held there. A cold dread began to settle in my stomach, though I still couldn't quite predict where this conversation was heading. Chloe finally looked up from the coffee service, her face flushed but determined. Mom, what Damien is trying to say is that we've learned there are some specific protocols for events at Rosewood Manor. Social protocols that we need to follow to ensure everything goes smoothly. What kind of protocols? I asked, though part of me already suspected I didn't want to hear the answer. Damien leaned forward, his expression earnest and concerned. Well, for instance, the guest list has to be carefully coordinated to ensure that everyone feels comfortable with the social dynamics. The venue management is very particular about maintaining a certain atmosphere. The room fell silent except for the ticking of the grandfather clock in the corner, a wedding gift from James's parents that Chloe had always loved. I waited, sensing that the real blow was still coming. The thing is, Chloe said finally, her voice barely above a whisper, Patricia has been working closely with the venue coordinator to finalize all the details. She's been so helpful, Mom. She really understands how these high-end venues operate. Patricia, of course. I should have known that my future daughter-in-law's mother would be at the center of whatever was coming next. According to Patricia, Damien continued, venues like Rosewood Manor have very specific guidelines about family presentations during formal ceremonies. They prefer when wedding parties can demonstrate, how should I put this, unified social standings among immediate family members. The careful euphemisms were making me dizzy. What exactly are you trying to tell me? Damien and Chloe exchanged a look that seemed to carry an entire conversation. Finally, Damien spoke again, his voice gentle but firm. Lydia, we think it might be best if you attended the wedding as a regular guest rather than being formally announced as mother of the bride during the reception. The words hit me like a physical blow, but somehow I managed to keep my voice steady. I'm sorry, could you repeat that? It's not about you personally, Chloe rushed to explain, her words tumbling over each other. It's just that when they introduce the wedding party and immediate family, there's a certain presentation that's expected. Patricia explained that venues like this have traditions about how families are presented. And since you're not remarried and don't have the same social connections. She trailed off, unable to finish the sentence, but the implication was crystal clear. I wasn't good enough to be publicly acknowledged as the mother of the bride, because my single, working-class status would embarrass them in front of their sophisticated guests. You want me to attend my own daughter's wedding incognito, I said slowly, making sure I understood correctly. You want me to sit in the audience like any other guest while you pretend I don't exist. That's not how we're thinking about it at all, Damien protested. You would still be there for all the important moments. You'd still see Chloe walk down the aisle, still be part of the celebration. It's just a matter of the formal presentations and seating arrangements. Seating arrangements. They had even thought about where to hide me during the reception. Where exactly would I be seated? I asked, morbid curiosity overcoming my shock. Another exchanged glance between them. Patricia thought table 12 would be perfect, Chloe said quietly. It's got a lovely view of the dance floor, and you'd be seated with some very nice people, the Hendersons and the Clarks. They're friends of the Castellano family, and Patricia thinks you'd have a lot in common with them. Table 12. I didn't need to see the seating chart to know that table 12 was in the back of the room, probably behind a pillar, where the less important guests were traditionally placed. They wanted to stick me with strangers. People carefully chosen by Patricia to be appropriate companions for the embarrassing relative they needed to manage. And during the ceremony, I pressed, needing to understand the full scope of their plan. Where would I sit then? In the third row, Damien answered quickly, as if he'd been prepared for this question. Patricia thought that would be perfect. Close enough to see everything clearly, but not so prominent as to create any complications. Complications. There was that word again. I was a complication to be managed, a problem to be solved, an embarrassment to be minimized. What about the processional? I asked, my voice growing colder with each question. Traditionally, the mother of the bride is escorted down the aisle and seated in the front row. Chloe's face crumpled slightly. Mom, please don't make this harder than it needs to be. Patricia explained that some of the more traditional elements can seem outdated at venues like Rosewood Manor. The important thing is that you'll be there to witness our happiness. Witness their happiness. From the third row, at table 12, without acknowledgement. Like a stranger who had managed to score an invitation to someone else's celebration. Let me make sure I understand this completely, I said, setting down my coffee cup with deliberate care. You want me to attend your wedding as if I'm not related to you? You want me to watch strangers escort you down the aisle while I sit in the audience? You want me to eat dinner with people I've never met while you celebrate at the head table with your new family? And you want me to do all of this quietly and gratefully because the venue you specifically chose has protocols that make acknowledging me as your mother inappropriate. The silence that followed was deafening. Finally, Damien spoke, his voice carrying a note of frustration that he tried to disguise as patience. Lydia, you're making this sound much more dramatic than it needs to be. Thousands of families navigate these social situations successfully. It's just about understanding the appropriate frameworks for different types of events. Frameworks, social situations, appropriate protocols. Every word was designed to make their cruelty sound reasonable. Their betrayal seemed like simple etiquette. And what, I asked quietly, does your mother think about these frameworks? Patricia. I realized I had deliberately not mentioned her name, as if saying it out loud would make this entire conversation too real to bear. Patricia has been incredibly gracious about everything, Chloe said, her voice gaining strength as she shifted into defense mode. She's been so patient, explaining how these things work in their social circle. She wants to make sure everything is perfect for our special day. Perfect. Their special day would be perfect, precisely because I would be erased from it. She even offered to introduce you to the other guests at table 12 beforehand, Damien added, as if this were some generous gesture rather than a calculated insult. She thought it might help you feel more comfortable if you had a chance to meet them in a casual setting first. The final insult. Patricia Castellano, the woman who was systematically removing me from my daughter's life, was offering to manage my social interactions at my own child's wedding like I was some awkward relative who couldn't be trusted to navigate a dinner party on my own. As I sat there in that perfectly appointed living room looking at my daughter and the man she planned to marry, I realized that this moment had been inevitable from the beginning. Every small compromise, every subtle slight, every gentle suggestion that I step back a little further, it had all been leading to this complete erasure of my role in Chloe's life. They weren't asking me to attend the wedding differently. They were asking me to stop being Chloe's mother. At least publicly. At least when it mattered. At least when anyone important was watching. And the most devastating part of all was the expectation in their eyes that I would agree to this humiliation gratefully, that I would smile and nod and thank them for still allowing me to witness their happiness from the shadows. They had no idea they had just declared war on the wrong woman. I drove home from that dinner in a state of shock so complete that I barely remembered the journey. My hands gripped the steering wheel with white-knuckled intensity as their words echoed in my mind. Regular guest. Table 12. Complications. By the time I pulled into my driveway, the shock had crystallized into something far more dangerous. A cold, calculating fury unlike anything I had ever experienced. I sat in my car for nearly an hour, staring at the house where I had raised Chloe, where I had taught her to ride a bicycle and helped her with algebra homework and celebrated every milestone of her life. The porch light was on, casting the same warm glow that had welcomed us both home countless times over the years. But tonight, that familiar comfort felt like a mockery of everything I thought our relationship had meant. Finally, I forced myself to go inside, where the silence of the empty house pressed against me like a physical weight. Every family photo on the walls seemed to mock me. Images of birthday parties and graduations, mother-daughter trips and quiet Sunday mornings. All the moments that had supposedly built an unbreakable bond between us. How naive I had been to think that love and sacrifice automatically earned respect and loyalty. I poured myself a glass of wine, not the expensive vintages I kept for special occasions, but a simple bottle I had been saving for no particular reason. Tonight felt like the right time to stop saving things for later. I carried it to my home office, where the Rosewood Manor booking contract still sat on my desk, waiting for my response. The irony was so perfect, it was almost artistic. Here were Chloe and Damien, begging to use my venue for their wedding while simultaneously asking me to pretend I wasn't their family. Here was Patricia Castellano, desperately wanting to access the exclusivity and prestige I had created, while treating me like I was beneath her social standards. Here were three people who had spent months making me feel small and unwanted, unknowingly placing themselves completely at my mercy. I opened my laptop and began researching everything I could find about the Castellano family's business and social connections. What I discovered was both illuminating and infuriating. Castellano Textile Imports was successful but not nearly as prestigious as they pretended. Their annual revenue was solid but unremarkable, probably a tenth of what my hospitality empire generated. Their social connections were real but largely superficial. The kind of networking relationships that depended on mutual benefit rather than genuine friendship. More tellingly, I found evidence that Antonio Castellano had been quietly struggling with increased competition from overseas suppliers. Several of their major contracts had not been renewed in the past year, and they had been forced to lay off nearly 20% of their workforce. The family was maintaining their lifestyle and social standing, but their financial foundation was far shakier than they wanted anyone to know. The picture that emerged was of a family desperately clinging to an image of success and sophistication, while their actual power and influence slowly eroded. They needed this wedding to go perfectly not just for social reasons, but as a demonstration that the Castellano name still carried weight in their community. They needed to prove that they could still afford the best, still attract the right kind of people, still command respect from the social circles they considered important. And they had unknowingly made themselves completely dependent on me to provide that proof. As I sat there in my office, surrounded by the awards and recognition I had earned through decades of hard work, I began to understand the full scope of my power in this situation. I could give them the perfect wedding they were planning at my venue, allowing them to humiliate me while taking my money. I could refuse the booking and force them to scramble for alternatives with only 5 months remaining. Or I could use this opportunity to teach them exactly what happened when they underestimated and disrespected Lydia Thornfield. I thought about my scholarship recipients, young people like Amanda Rodriguez and Marcus Chen, who understood the value of hard work and the importance of treating everyone with dignity regardless of their background. I thought about Giuseppe at Bella Court, who had built something beautiful with his own hands and deserved better than to be dismissed by someone like Damien. I thought about all the service workers and small business owners and self-made entrepreneurs who were constantly told they weren't good enough for the right social circles. But mostly, I thought about James and what he would say if he could see how our daughter had turned out. James, who had fallen in love with a waitress and never once made me feel like I needed to apologize for my background. James, who had taught me that character mattered more than social standing, that kindness was more valuable than connections, that love was about lifting each other up rather than tearing each other down. Chloe had forgotten every lesson he had tried to teach her. She had forgotten every value I had tried to instill in her. She had chosen to embrace a worldview that measured worth through exclusion and cruelty, and she had chosen to do it at my expense. The decision, when it finally crystallized in my mind, brought with it a sense of calm I hadn't felt in months. I was done being the accommodating mother who stepped aside gracefully when her presence became inconvenient. I was done being the understanding woman who absorbed insults and humiliation in the name of keeping peace. I was done pretending that love meant accepting disrespect. I picked up my phone and scrolled through my contacts until I found the number for Harrison Webb, the attorney who had handled my business affairs for over a decade. Harrison was discreet, brilliant, and had a particular talent for crafting legally airtight contracts that protected his clients' interests in ways that might not be immediately obvious to the other party. "Harrison," I said when he answered, despite the late hour, "it's Lydia Thornfield. I need you to prepare some very specific contract modifications, and I need them done tonight." "Lydia, it's nearly 11 o'clock. Is everything all right?" "Everything is about to be perfect," I said, and for the first time in months, I meant it. "I'm about to respond to a venue booking request, and I want to make sure the terms are absolutely clear to all parties involved." I spent the next 2 hours detailing exactly what I wanted Harrison to include in the modified contract. Standard cancellation policies, payment schedules, and liability clauses, yes, but also some very specific language about event management, family acknowledgments, and the responsibilities of all parties to maintain appropriate respect for venue ownership and staff. By the time I hung up the phone, I had crafted a response that would give the Castellano family exactly what they thought they wanted, while ensuring that I maintained complete control over every aspect of their celebration. They would get their exclusive venue, their prestigious celebration, their perfect wedding, but only on my terms, and only as long as they treated me with the respect I deserved. The beauty of my plan was its simplicity. I wasn't going to storm into their lives making demands or ultimatums. I wasn't going to create scenes or force confrontations. I was simply going to be exactly who I had always been, a successful businesswoman who provided exceptional service to clients who understood the value of what she offered. The difference was that this time, I wouldn't be hiding my success or downplaying my accomplishments. This time, I wouldn't be the modest mother who stayed in the background. This time, they would deal with Lydia Thornfield, owner and operator of the most exclusive wedding venue in 3 states, and they would treat me accordingly. As I prepared for bed that night, I felt something I hadn't experienced in years: anticipation. Tomorrow, I would call Rebecca and instruct her to schedule a meeting with the Castellano family to discuss their booking request. Tomorrow, I would begin the process of showing them exactly who they had been dealing with all along. Tomorrow, Patricia Castellano would discover that the woman she had been systematically excluding from her son's wedding was the same woman who held the power to make or break their social standing. Tomorrow, Damien would learn that the complications he was so worried about avoiding had just become infinitely more complicated. And tomorrow, Chloe would begin to understand the true cost of choosing social status over family loyalty, of prioritizing appearance over substance, of forgetting the values that had shaped her into the person she used to be. I had spent months watching them treat me like I was disposable. Now it was time for them to discover just how indispensable I actually was. The game was about to begin, and for the first time since this whole ordeal started, I was the one holding all the cards. The meeting was scheduled for Thursday at 2 p.m. in the executive boardroom of Rosewood Manor. I had specifically chosen the most impressive conference room in the building, the one with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the lake, original oil paintings on the walls, and a mahogany table that could seat 20 people comfortably. I wanted the Castellano family to understand immediately that they were entering my domain, even if they didn't yet realize whose domain it was. Rebecca had made the arrangements with military precision, following my detailed instructions exactly. "Please inform Mrs. Castellano that Miss Thornfield, the venue owner, will be personally handling their booking consultation, I had told her. Emphasize that this level of personal attention is reserved only for our most prestigious clients. I arrived 30 minutes early, wearing my best business suit, a charcoal gray ensemble that had cost more than most people's monthly salary but looked understated enough to avoid appearing flashy. My jewelry was minimal but expensive, pearl earrings that had belonged to James's grandmother, and a watch that was a gift to myself when my company hit its first 10 million in revenue. I wanted to look successful without being ostentatious, professional without being intimidating, at least not yet. I positioned myself at the head of the conference table with the Casta contract file spread before me, along with portfolios showcasing some of our most successful events. The afternoon light streaming through the windows created exactly the kind of elegant atmosphere that would appeal to Patricia's sense of what was appropriate for important business discussions. They arrived precisely on time, which impressed me despite everything else about them that didn't. Patricia entered first, wearing a cream-colored suit that probably cost twice what most people earned in a month, followed by Antonio in an equally expensive navy blazer. Damien brought up the rear, looking confident and relaxed in a way that suggested he expected this meeting to be a mere formality. What struck me immediately was how differently they moved through the space compared to how they had acted in my modest home. Here, surrounded by obvious luxury and exclusivity, they seemed to straighten their spines, lift their chins, and adopt the kind of reverential behavior usually reserved for churches or museums. They belonged here, their posture seemed to say. This was their natural environment. Rebecca ushered them in with perfect professionalism, offering coffee or water and ensuring they were comfortably seated before discreetly withdrawing. For a moment, the four of us simply looked at each other across the polished mahogany surface. Mrs. Castellano, Mr. Castellano, Mr. Damien, I began formally, extending my hand to each of them in turn. I'm Lydia Thornfield, owner of Rosewood Manor. Thank you for taking the time to meet with me today. The reaction was instantaneous and exactly what I had expected. Patricia's face went through a series of expressions: confusion, recognition, and then something approaching panic. Antonio's eyebrows shot up so high they nearly disappeared into his hairline. But it was Damien's reaction that I found most satisfying. His confident smile froze on his face like a mask that had suddenly become too heavy to wear. I'm sorry, Patricia said slowly, her voice carefully controlled but with an undertone of barely contained shock. Did you say Lydia Thornfield, as in Chloe's mother? The very same, I replied pleasantly, settling back into my chair with the kind of relaxed confidence that comes from holding all the power in a situation. Though I believe the more relevant introduction for today's purposes is that I'm the owner and operator of this venue, which you've requested for your son's wedding celebration. The silence that followed was so complete I could hear the grandfather clock ticking in the corner of the room. Patricia's face had gone pale beneath her expertly applied makeup, while Antonio kept opening and closing his mouth like a fish gasping for air. Damien, to his credit, recovered more quickly than his parents, though I could see the rapid calculations happening behind his eyes as he tried to figure out how to salvage this situation. We had no idea, Patricia finally managed, her voice smaller than I had ever heard it. When we made the booking inquiry, we were told the owner would handle our consultation personally, but we never imagined that the woman you've been systematically excluding from your son's wedding planning would turn out to own the venue you desperately want to book. I finished for her. Yes, I can see how that would be surprising. Antonio found his voice first, his business instincts kicking in despite the obvious awkwardness of the situation. Lydia, Mrs. Thornfield, I think there may have been some misunderstandings about the wedding arrangements. Perhaps we should discuss— Oh, there have definitely been misunderstandings, I interrupted smoothly. For instance, I was under the impression that families typically want to include the mother of the bride in wedding planning decisions. I was also under the impression that successful business people recognize and respect other successful business people, regardless of their backgrounds. But perhaps I've misunderstood the protocols for high society events. Damien leaned forward, his charm offensive beginning in earnest. "Mrs. Thornfield, Lydia, I think there's been a terrible communication breakdown. We would never intentionally exclude you from anything." The suggestions about seating arrangements and other details were simply attempts to ensure the event ran smoothly for everyone involved. "Ah, yes," I said, consulting the notes I had taken during our dinner conversation. "Table 12, wasn't it? Third row for the ceremony? No acknowledgement as mother of the bride because it might create complications for your venue's sophisticated atmosphere?" Each word landed like a small explosion in the quiet room. Patricia actually flinched when I mentioned table 12, while Antonio's face flushed red with what I assumed was embarrassment at his son's behavior. "Those weren't our suggestions," Patricia said quickly, shooting a sharp look at Damien. "I was simply sharing what I thought were standard protocols for formal venues. I had no idea that this was your establishment." It was a masterful attempt at deflection, but I had been in business too long to fall for such obvious manipulation. "Mrs. Castellano, I have detailed notes from our conversation about maintaining appropriate professional boundaries with the staff and ensuring proper tone throughout the celebration. Would you like me to read them back to you?" The temperature in the room seemed to drop several degrees. Patricia's confident facade was crumbling visibly, replaced by the desperate calculation of someone trying to figure out how much damage control was possible. "Perhaps," Antonio interjected, "we should focus on moving forward rather than dwelling on past misunderstandings. Lydia, you're clearly a successful businesswoman, and we're hoping to book your venue for a very important family celebration. Surely we can work together professionally, regardless of any personal dynamics." "Professional cooperation requires mutual respect," I replied calmly. "It requires acknowledgement of each party's value and contribution. It requires treating people with the dignity they've earned through their accomplishments and character." I opened the contract file and spread the documents across the table. "Your booking request indicates you want to spend approximately $60,000 for a single evening celebration. That's a significant investment, and it demonstrates that you understand the value of what Rosewood Manor provides." All three of them nodded, sensing that we were finally getting to the business discussion they had come for. "However," I continued, "my venue has certain standards and expectations that all clients must meet. We require that all parties involved in the celebration treat our staff, our facilities, and our management with appropriate respect. We require that families acknowledge and honor the contributions of all parties who make their celebration possible. And we require that clients demonstrate the same level of sophistication and class in their personal interactions that they expect from our service." Damien's face was beginning to show the first signs of real concern. "Of course," he said quickly. "We completely understand the importance of maintaining professional standards." "Excellent," I smiled, though there was nothing warm about the expression. "Because your recent behavior suggests a significant disconnect between what you claim to value and how you actually treat people. You've spent months telling my daughter that I'm not sophisticated enough to be properly acknowledged at your wedding, while simultaneously begging to book the venue I built with my own hands and business acumen." The truth hung in the air between us like a sword waiting to fall. I could see each of them processing the full implications of their situation, understanding for the first time that they had not just insulted a random relative, but had systematically attacked the very person whose cooperation they desperately needed. "So here's what's going to happen," I said, my voice taking on the steel that had served me well in countless business negotiations. "We're going to discuss the terms under which I might be willing to provide my venue for your celebration. And those terms are going to include some very specific requirements about family acknowledgments, seating arrangements, and the respect that will be shown to all parties involved in making your perfect day possible." The meeting was about to get very interesting indeed. I let the silence stretch for nearly a full minute, watching the Castellano family absorb the reality of their situation. The afternoon light had shifted, casting longer shadows across the conference table and creating an atmosphere that felt almost theatrical in its intensity. Finally, I opened the leather portfolio that contained the contract Harrison had prepared and placed it at the center of the table. "Before we discuss whether Rosewood Manor will host your celebration," I began, my voice carrying the authority of someone who had spent decades building and protecting an empire, "I need to establish some non-negotiable terms. These aren't suggestions or guidelines. They are requirements that must be met in full if you wish to proceed." Patricia shifted uncomfortably in her chair, while Antonio leaned forward slightly, his business instincts telling him to pay careful attention to what came next. Damien remained frozen, clearly understanding that his carefully constructed plans were about to be completely restructured. "First," I said, consulting the documents before me, "the formal acknowledgement requirement. If this event proceeds, I will be introduced and recognized as mother of the bride during every appropriate moment of the celebration. This includes being escorted down the aisle during the processional, being seated in the front row during the ceremony, and being formally announced during the reception introductions. There will be no modified presentations, no relegation to back tables, and no attempts to minimize my role in my daughter's life." I looked directly at Patricia as I spoke. "I understand that you may have different ideas about wedding protocols, Mrs. Castellano, but at my venue we honor traditional family structures and the people who have earned their place through decades of love and sacrifice." "Of course," Antonio said quickly, though his voice lacked conviction. "Family is very important to all of us." "Excellent," I replied with a smile that didn't reach my eyes. "I'm glad we agree on that principle, which brings me to my second requirement, the respect clause. Every member of your family will treat me with the same level of courtesy and consideration that you would show to any other successful business owner whose services you require. This means no condescending comments about my background, no dismissive attitudes about my work, and no attempts to manage or control my interactions with other guests." Damien finally found his voice. "Mrs. Thornfield, I want you to know that any perceived disrespect was completely unintentional. We have nothing but admiration for what you've accomplished." "How refreshing," I said dryly. "Because your behavior over the past several months has suggested quite the opposite. You've made it clear that you consider my working-class origins to be an embarrassment to your family's reputation. You've dismissed my opinions, excluded me from decisions, and treated me like a problem to be managed rather than a person to be respected." I turned the page in my portfolio, revealing a detailed breakdown of costs and services, which leads me to my third requirement, the payment structure. Given the unique circumstances of this booking, I'm implementing a modified payment schedule that reflects the full value of what Rosewood Manor provides. "What kind of modification?" Antonio asked, his businessman's wariness finally kicking in. "Standard bookings pay 50% up front and 50% 30 days before the event," I explained. "However, for clients who have demonstrated difficulty with professional courtesy and respect, I require full payment in advance, plus a 25% premium for what we call high-maintenance client services." The number hit them like a physical blow. Patricia actually gasped, while Antonio's face went pale. "That would be," he began calculating, $75,000, due in full within 2 weeks of contract signing. I finished for him. Non-refundable, of course, given the short timeline and the specific accommodations we'll need to make. $75,000? Damien repeated, his voice climbing an octave. That's more than we budgeted for the entire wedding." "Then perhaps you should have considered that before you decided to treat the venue owner like hired help," I replied calmly. "Excellence has a price, Mr. Damien, and disrespect carries an even higher one." Patricia finally found her voice, though it shook with barely controlled anger. "This is extortion. You're taking advantage of our family connection to demand unreasonable terms." I laughed, actually laughed, at her accusation. "Mrs. Castellano, you have spent months trying to erase me from my daughter's wedding because you consider me beneath your social standards. You have demanded that I sit in the back row of my own child's ceremony, like a stranger who barely deserves an invitation. You have treated me with a level of disrespect that would be shocking if directed at any business owner, let alone a family member. And now you're accusing me of taking advantage of our connection? I stood up, walking to the window that overlooked the gardens where dozens of couples had celebrated their most important moments. Let me be very clear about something. The family connection you're referring to has been systematically attacked and undermined by your family for months. If you wanted family rates and family consideration, you should have treated me like family instead of like an inconvenience. What if we can't afford those terms? Antonio asked quietly, and I could hear the genuine worry in his voice. Then you'll need to find another venue, I replied without hesitation. I'm sure there are other establishments that would be happy to accommodate your budget and your attitudes toward working-class entrepreneurs. The silence that followed was different from the earlier shocked quiet. This was the silence of people realizing that all their leverage had disappeared, that their careful plans were crumbling, and that they were completely at the mercy of someone they had grossly underestimated. There's more, I continued, returning to my seat and turning to the next page of the contract, the staff interaction clause. During your event, you will treat every member of my staff with the same respect you would show to guests at your own home. This means proper please and thank yous, reasonable requests delivered in respectful tones, and absolutely no dismissive or condescending behavior toward the people who will be working to make your celebration perfect. I looked directly at Damien. I've seen how you treat service workers, young man. Giuseppe at Bellacourt still remembers your rude behavior and fake shellfish allergy. That kind of attitude will not be tolerated at my establishment. Damien's face flushed red with embarrassment at being called out so directly. Furthermore, I continued, the guest list approval clause. Since you've made it clear that you're concerned about the appropriate people attending your celebration, I'm requiring approval rights over your final guest list. Anyone who has a documented history of treating my staff or other service workers poorly will not be permitted on the premises. You can't dictate who we invite to our own wedding, Patricia protested. I absolutely can, I replied firmly. It's my property, Mrs. Castellano. I have the right to refuse service to anyone whose behavior might create problems for my staff or other clients. If you want to celebrate at Rosewood Manor, you'll invite people who understand how to behave in civilized society. I closed the portfolio and looked at each of them in turn. Finally, the most important clause of all, the relationship requirement. If this wedding proceeds under my conditions, it will mark the beginning of a new dynamic between our families. Chloe will be my daughter first, and your daughter-in-law second. I will be acknowledged, respected, and included in family decisions that affect her well-being. The days of treating me like an embarrassment or an afterthought are over. The weight of my ultimatum settled over the room like a heavy blanket. I could see each of them processing the reality that their perfect wedding, the social triumph they had been planning, would only happen if they completely restructured their attitudes and behavior. These terms are non-negotiable, I said finally. You have until Monday morning to decide whether you can meet them. If you can, we'll proceed with the booking under these conditions. If you can't, I'll be happy to provide you with a list of other venues that might better suit your budget and your social preferences. I stood up, signaling that the meeting was over. Rebecca will show you out. Take the weekend to discuss this as a family, and let me know your decision on Monday. As they filed out of the conference room, I could hear the beginning of what would undoubtedly be a very intense family discussion. Patricia's voice was already rising with indignation, while Antonio seemed to be calculating financial implications. But it was Damien's face that stayed with me as they left, the look of a man who was finally beginning to understand that actions have consequences, that words have power, and that the woman he had tried to diminish was actually the one person who could give him everything he wanted. Or take it all away. The weekend that followed was the longest of my life. I spent Saturday morning tending to my garden, trying to find peace in the simple act of nurturing growing things, while my mind churned over the possible outcomes of Thursday's confrontation. Every time my phone rang, my heart jumped, but it was never the call I was both dreading and anticipating. By Sunday evening, I had convinced myself that they would reject my terms and attempt to find another venue. The financial burden alone, $75,000 up front, would be devastating to a family already struggling with their business finances. And the ego blow of accepting my conditions after months of treating me as inferior would be almost impossible for people like the Castellanos to swallow. I was in my home office, researching alternative venues I could recommend when they inevitably called to decline, when my phone finally rang at 8:47 p.m. The caller ID showed Chloe's number, not Damien's or Patricia's, which surprised me. "Hello, sweetheart," I answered, keeping my voice carefully neutral. "Mom." Her voice was small, strained, and I could hear she had been crying. "Can I come over? I need to talk to you." 20 minutes later, Chloe stood on my doorstep looking more vulnerable than I had seen her since she was a child. Her usually perfect makeup was smudged, her hair was disheveled, and she was clutching a crumpled tissue in her hand. When I opened the door, she fell into my arms with a sob that seemed to come from somewhere deep in her soul. "I'm so sorry, Mom," she whispered against my shoulder. "I'm so sorry." I led her to the living room, the same space where we had shared countless conversations over the years, about school projects and boyfriend troubles, career decisions, and life dreams. Tonight, it felt like we were meeting as strangers trying to find their way back to each other. "The last 3 days have been hell," she began, accepting the cup of tea I offered her. "After the meeting on Thursday, Damien's family went completely insane. Patricia was screaming about how you had manipulated the situation and how we needed to put you in your place. Antonio kept running numbers, trying to figure out if they could afford your terms without completely bankrupting themselves." She paused, taking a shaky sip of her tea, but it was Damien's reaction that really opened my eyes. "When we got back to their house, he wasn't angry at his parents for treating you badly. He was angry at me for not managing you better. He said I should have told you about their venue connections from the beginning so you would know your place." My blood ran cold at those words. "Know my place?" "That's what he said, that you needed to understand that marrying into their family meant accepting their social hierarchy." Chloe's voice broke on the last words. "He said you were being uppity, and that someone needed to remind you that money doesn't buy class." The casual cruelty of his words hit me like a physical blow, but I could see that they had devastated Chloe even more. "What did you say?" At first I tried to defend him. I said he was just stressed about the wedding costs and didn't mean it the way it sounded. She looked at me with eyes full of shame. But then Patricia started talking about how they could work around your demands by booking a different venue and simply not telling you until the last minute. She said that would teach you not to get above yourself when dealing with your betters. The calculated cruelty of their backup plan was breathtaking, but not entirely surprising given what I had witnessed of their character. "That's when something clicked for me," Chloe continued, her voice growing stronger. "I realized I was sitting in a room full of people plotting to humiliate my mother, the woman who had sacrificed everything to give me opportunities, and I had been going along with it for months." She set down her teacup and turned to face me fully. "Mom, I don't know how I became this person. I don't know when I started caring more about their approval than about the values you taught me. But sitting there, listening to them plan ways to hurt you, I finally understood what I had become." "What happened next?" I asked quietly. "I told them the wedding was off." Her voice was firm now, resolute. "I told them that any family that would treat you with such disrespect wasn't a family I wanted to join. I told Damien that if he couldn't see the value in the woman who raised me, then he didn't deserve to marry me." My heart swelled with pride and relief, but I tried to keep my expression neutral. "How did they react?" "About as well as you'd expect." Patricia accused me of being ungrateful and throwing away the best opportunity I'd ever have. Antonio tried to play peacemaker, saying we could work something out. But Damien, she shook her head sadly. Damien showed me exactly who he really was. She pulled out her phone and scrolled through her messages. He sent me this yesterday morning. I read the text message she handed me, my anger building with each word. You're making a huge mistake choosing your working-class mother over our family's connections. When you're ready to apologize and accept your place in our social circle, maybe we can discuss reconciliation. Until then, enjoy your little rebellion. Enjoy your little rebellion, I repeated, disgusted by the condescension dripping from every word. That message made everything crystal clear, Chloe said. He doesn't see me as an equal partner. He sees me as a project to be improved, someone he can mold into his family's idea of an appropriate wife. And he sees you as an obstacle to that transformation. We sat in silence for a moment, both processing the magnitude of what had just happened. My daughter had walked away from what many would consider an advantageous marriage to defend the mother she had been systematically excluding from her life. Mom, I know I don't deserve it, but I need to ask for your forgiveness. Chloe's voice was barely above a whisper. I let them convince me that love meant adapting to their standards instead of honoring the people who had always loved me unconditionally. I treated you like you were something to be ashamed of instead of celebrating everything you had accomplished. Chloe, please let me finish, she interrupted. I need you to know that I understand what I did. I didn't just exclude you from wedding planning. I excluded you from my life. I adopted their prejudices and their cruelty, and I directed it at the person who deserved it least. I became someone I don't even recognize. Tears were streaming down her face now, but her voice remained steady. I know you probably think I'm only here because the wedding fell apart. And maybe part of that's true. But sitting in that room, listening to them plot against you, I realized that I had already lost something much more valuable than any marriage. I had lost myself. I reached out and took her hands in mine. Sweetheart, you haven't lost yourself. You found yourself again. Can you forgive me? She asked, her voice breaking. You're my daughter, I said simply. I will always love you, and I will always forgive you. But more importantly, you need to forgive yourself and figure out who you want to be going forward. She nodded, wiping her eyes. I want to be someone you can be proud of again. Someone who stands up for the people she loves instead of tearing them down to impress others. You already are, I told her, and I meant it. It takes tremendous courage to walk away from a life that looks perfect on the surface but is rotten underneath. It takes even more courage to admit when you've made mistakes and commit to doing better. We talked until nearly midnight, about everything and nothing, about the past and the future, about the importance of staying true to your values even when it's difficult. For the first time in months, I felt like I was talking to my real daughter, the woman I had raised to be strong and independent and kind. As she was preparing to leave, Chloe turned to me one more time. Mom, there's something else I need to tell you. Tomorrow morning, I'm calling the Castellanos to formally break the engagement and return the ring. But before I do that, I want you to know that if you decide to cancel their venue booking anyway, I'll support that decision completely. They don't deserve your services after how they've treated you. I smiled at her, feeling lighter than I had in months. We'll see what tomorrow brings, sweetheart. But whatever happens, we'll face it together. After she left, I sat in my quiet house and realized that I had gotten something much more valuable than revenge or vindication. I had gotten my daughter back. The woman who had walked away from a wealthy fiancé to defend her mother's dignity was the same little girl who had once refused to go to a birthday party because the host's parents had been rude to the babysitter. Chloe had found her way home, and that was worth more than any business victory could ever be. Monday morning arrived with the kind of crisp autumn air that promised new beginnings. I was in my office at Rosewood Manor by 7 a.m., not because I was nervous about the Castellanos' response. Chloe's visit had already given me the only answer that truly mattered, but because I had important business to conduct. The first call I made was to Harrison Webb. Harrison, I need you to prepare a formal cancellation notice for the Castellano booking. Professional language, nothing vindictive but absolutely clear that Rosewood Manor will not be available for their event. "Are you sure about this, Lydia?" he asked. "That's a significant amount of revenue to walk away from." "I've never been more sure of anything in my life," I replied. "Some principles are worth more than money." The second call was to Rebecca. "Clear my calendar for this afternoon. I want to personally call each of the vendors that Castellanos have likely booked and let them know the wedding is canceled. Most of them are small business owners who can't afford to get stiffed on deposits." At 9:15 a.m., my phone rang. Patricia Castellanos' name appeared on the caller ID, and I let it ring 3 times before answering. "Rosewood Manor, Lydia Thornfield speaking." "Mrs. Thornfield." Patricia's voice was strained, but attempting to maintain dignity. "We've discussed your terms over the weekend, and we're prepared to move forward with the booking." I had expected this call, though I was somewhat surprised by the lack of groveling in her tone. "I appreciate you getting back to me, Mrs. Castellano, but I'm afraid the booking is no longer available." Silence. Then, "I'm sorry, what did you say?" "The booking is canceled. Rosewood Manor will not be hosting your son's wedding." But you said we had until Monday morning to decide. We're calling to accept your terms." "Mrs. Castellano," I said calmly, "your son's engagement ended yesterday evening. Since there is no longer a wedding to plan, there is no longer a venue needed." Another pause, longer this time. "That's impossible. Damien would have told us if anything had changed. Perhaps you should have that conversation with your son. In the meantime, I'll be sending you a formal cancellation notice today. If you had placed any deposits with other vendors, I recommend contacting them immediately to minimize your losses." "You can't do this." Patricia's voice was rising now, the careful composure finally cracking. "We need that venue. Do you have any idea what this will do to our family's reputation?" "Mrs. Castellano," I replied with a calmness that I genuinely felt, "your family's reputation is not my responsibility. However, I would suggest that treating people with respect might be a good place to start rebuilding it." I ended the call and immediately had Rebecca block the Castellano family's numbers. Whatever drama was about to unfold in their household, I wanted no part of it. The rest of the morning was spent in productive tasks that felt like cleansing rituals. I personally called Giuseppe at Bellacourt and made a reservation for dinner with Chloe that evening, our first meal as a reunited family. I called the principal at Riverside Elementary to increase my scholarship fund contribution for the coming year. And I called my contractor to begin plans for a new addition to Rosewood Manor, a small museum space dedicated to showcasing the stories of successful entrepreneurs from working-class backgrounds. At lunchtime, Chloe arrived at my office with sandwiches from the delicatessen where she had worked one summer during college. "I thought you might be too busy to eat," she said, settling into the chair across from my desk. "And I wanted to give you this." She handed me a small velvet box, Damien's engagement ring. "I drove to his apartment this morning and returned it personally," she said. "He tried to convince me I was making a mistake, that I was throwing away security and social status for sentiment. When I told him that some things were more valuable than money or status, he said I was being naive." "What did you say to that?" "I told him that my mother had taught me the difference between being naive and having principles, and that I'd rather be naive with integrity than sophisticated without a soul." I reached across the desk and squeezed her hand. "I'm proud of you, sweetheart. It couldn't have been easy." "Actually, it was easier than I expected," she admitted. Once I started speaking from my heart instead of trying to impress him, I realized we never had anything real in common. All our conversations were about appearances and expectations, never about hopes or dreams or the things that actually matter. We ate our lunch together in comfortable silence, occasionally commenting on the couples taking engagement photos in the gardens below. There was a peaceful quality to the moment that I hadn't experienced in months. The simple pleasure of being with my daughter without undercurrents of tension or unspoken conflicts. "Mom," Chloe said as we finished eating, "I want you to know that I'm not just apologizing for the wedding situation. I'm apologizing for losing sight of who you raised me to be, for forgetting that success isn't about who accepts you, but about how you treat others when you have the power to lift them up or tear them down. You know, I said thoughtfully, this whole experience has taught me something too. I spent so many years trying to be the perfect supportive mother that I forgot to model self-respect. I let people treat me poorly because I thought that was what love required, always putting others first, never demanding better treatment for myself. But you didn't let them treat you poorly in the end, Chloe pointed out. You stood up for yourself in the most spectacular way possible. Only after they forced my hand, I admitted, I should have set boundaries much earlier. I should have shown you that demanding respect isn't selfish. It's necessary for healthy relationships. That afternoon we worked together in my office, Chloe helping me update client files while we talked about her plans for the future. She had decided to quit her job at the advertising agency, a position she had never truly enjoyed, but had stayed in to impress Damien's family, and was considering returning to school for a degree in social work. I want to do something that matters, she explained, something that helps people instead of just selling them things they don't need. I keep thinking about your scholarship program and how much difference it's made in those kids' lives. You could work with the foundation, I suggested. We're expanding the program next year, and we'll need someone to handle the application process and mentor the recipients. Her face lit up in a way I hadn't seen since she was a child. Really? You'd trust me with something that important to you? Chloe, you're the most important thing to me. Of course I'd trust you with work that could change people's lives. As evening approached, we drove together to Bellacourt for dinner. Giuseppe greeted us with his usual warmth, and I noticed how naturally Chloe chatted with him in the broken Italian she had picked up during a college semester abroad. This was my real daughter. Curious, engaging, comfortable with people regardless of their backgrounds or accents. Over dinner, we talked about everything we had missed during the months of estrangement. Her growing dissatisfaction with her job, her doubts about Damien that she had been suppressing, her plans for the future. In return, I shared stories about my business successes that I had been downplaying for years, my travel plans for the coming year, and my ideas for expanding the scholarship program. I have something to tell you, I said as we were finishing our tiramisu. I've decided to semi-retire next year. Rebecca is ready to take over most of the day-to-day operations, and I want to focus more on the foundation and mentoring other women entrepreneurs. That's wonderful, Mom. You've earned the right to slow down and enjoy everything you've built. I was hoping, I continued, but you might want to travel with me sometimes. I'm planning a trip to Italy next spring to visit some of the artisans who created pieces for Rosewood Manor. And there's a conference in London about sustainable hospitality that I'd love to attend. I would love that, she said, her eyes bright with excitement. It sounds like the perfect way to figure out what comes next. As we drove home that evening, I reflected on the strange journey that had led us to this moment. What had started as a devastating betrayal had ultimately become a gift, the push I needed to finally demand the respect I deserved, and the wake-up call Chloe needed to remember who she really was. Mom, she said as I pulled into her apartment complex, thank you for not giving up on me, for fighting for our relationship even when I wasn't fighting for it myself. That's what mothers do, sweetheart. We see the best in our children even when they can't see it in themselves. 6 months later, I received a wedding invitation that made me smile. Giuseppe's daughter was getting married, and he had personally written a note asking if Rosewood Manor might be available for the reception. She has dreamed of celebrating there since she was a little girl helping in the restaurant, he wrote. It would mean everything to our family. I called him immediately to offer the venue as my gift to his daughter. Some celebrations are about love and family and community, and those are the ones that deserve the very best we can offer. As for the Castellanos, I heard through the local gossip network that Damien had quickly become engaged to someone else, a banking heiress whose family connections were even more impressive than their money. Patricia got her society wedding after all, though at a much less prestigious venue. I wished them well, genuinely. Some people are perfectly suited to lives built on appearances and social climbing. But my daughter had learned the difference between looking successful and actually building something meaningful, between being accepted by the right people and being the right person. And in the end, that lesson was worth far more than any wedding venue contract could ever be. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.